This is Christopher John Björknes. It is August 22nd, 2023. I'd like to start off by thanking those of you who have contributed to make this video possible. I wouldn't be able to do it without your help. I am deeply and sincerely grateful to you. I hope everyone else is as well. You wouldn't be seeing this video if it weren't for them, so I hope everyone joins me in thanking you very much. Anyone who would like to contribute, you can do so in the links in the description below. Those same links appear at my website, cjbbooks.com, where you will also find my books for sale. I'm really excited about doing this show. What I'm going to be explaining to you today is something that you're not supposed to know about or even begin to understand, but which has had a tremendous impact on the course of human events for the last 2,300 years, and which is guiding everything that is taking place on the earth today to one extent or another. In many areas, it's really what's behind what's happening. And this was parts of what I'm going to be talking about today were explained by Spinoza in the 1600s. And because he revealed some of these deeply meaningful secrets, he was excommunicated by the Hebrew community and severely persecuted. So as much as they want to keep it hidden, it is even more important for you to understand what it is I'm going to be laying out for you today. The Bible contains a tremendously significant narrative, and it starts out with the Israelites, the Hebrews, being in bondage in Egypt, and they want to free themselves from this bondage. And this bondage relates to the sovereignty of the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh was thought to be a demigod who was the son of the sun god Ra. The Egyptian god of darkness and chaos, Seth Typhon, chose these Hebrews who were supposedly being kept in slavery in Egypt as his chosen people. And through Moses, he freed his chosen people into the red lands of the wilderness. The wilderness was the kingdom of Seth Typhon, and he was the god of foreigners, and the Hebrews were foreigners under the sovereign reign of Ra and his son, the Pharaoh. So we have here a quest, and this is the key important thing. It was a quest by the Hebrews to free themselves from bondage and to become self-sovereign, to rule over themselves, to not be told what to do by others, to not have to live under the rules and the laws of the Egyptians and their god Ra, to not have to pay taxes to Pharaoh or serve as Pharaoh's slaves, but to obtain their own sovereignty, ultimately to become self-sovereign in a form of anarchy in the wilderness. But immediately, when they were freed, and as part of the process of their being freed, they fell under the theocracy of Moses. So they became the slaves of the God of Israel, Seth Typhon, and they became the slaves of Moses, and they had to pay taxes to these rulers, and these rulers imposed their laws and decisions on the Israelites. And Moses was the conduit, the mediator between heaven and earth, and he claimed to have the divine knowledge and to make the divine rules. And this is how this theocracy began. that lasted all the way through Samael in this narrative. This is all fiction, of course, but it's very tremendously important fiction because it creates this narrative of the Hebrews seeking self-sovereignty and freedom from bondage, and in their pursuit of that freedom, constantly having the sovereignty of a heavenly king imposed upon them in the form of this demonic god, Seth Typhon, who oppresses them, who curses them, who threatens them, who pits them against all other peoples and all other gods, because Seth Typhon wants to be the only king in the universe and to impose his will on everything and to claim that he created everything and therefore everything is his. And he demands absolute obedience from the Hebrews and was a terrible, tyrannical king, heavenly king. And they rebelled against both him and Moses. In the narrative, they cast the golden calf from the gold they had stolen from the Egyptians, which symbolized their stealing the god Ra from the Egyptians. A very significant figure, not so much in the Bible, but in the oral tradition, in the Talmud and other writings on the oral tradition. A man named Korah rebelled against Moses and Aaron, and it's explained in the oral tradition that this guy was kind of an anarchist, kind of a communist, and he rebelled against the sovereignty of Moses and Aaron. He said that the priests were ripping off the people in this theocracy, claiming the best parts of the sacrifice for themselves, that Moses was only pretending to speak for God, and that it was all a scam, and that it would be better if the people lived under anarchy and kind of like socialism or communism, as opposed to the theocratic rule of Moses and Aaron and their divine king in heaven, who was the ultimate sovereign, but who could only be interpreted through those who claimed to have spoken to him and received his divine message, the prophets and the judges that emerged, and the leaders of Israel in this theocracy. Then a very significant event happens in 1 Samuel chapter 8, and the Israelites say, hey, we want to be like the Gentiles, and we want to have a king, an earthly king, as opposed to a heavenly king, so that this earthly king can lead us into battles. They were always rebelling against the heavenly king. They were always challenging his authority and claiming that he was leading them into disaster and that he was a failed god and that the gods of the Gentiles were superior, and they wanted to take on those foreign gods and get rid of this cacodemon Seth Typhon, who was always cursing them and oppressing them. And all this culminated in the idea that they wanted an earthly king. And that kind of pissed off the God of Israel, Seth Typhon. And he advised Samuel to communicate. Again, you had to have a prophet speaking for God, and that prophet therefore obtains absolute authority and supposed divine authority in this scam of theocracy. And he advised them that if they so chose to have a king rule over them and make them his subjects, this king would be a tyrant, and he would enslave them, so they were right back in the condition of Egypt. And he would keep them in bondage, and he would make them fight his wars and serve in his chariots and do his labor. But Samuel told all this to the Israelites, and they said, hey, we want a king. So they got a king. They got a King Saul, and then they got a better King David, and then it went on to Solomon. And the kings ultimately were disastrous. They created infighting, fratricidal wars, internal struggles. They took on foreign wives, worshiped foreign gods. and brought disaster upon the Israelites. They were tyrannical. They collected funds as the priests collected funds. They lived in palaces. They had grand lives. Well, the people suffered. So the Hebrews, once again, were living in slavery. And they were not in a state of anarchy. They were not self-sovereigns. And they were not essentially gods themselves, as they had always sought to be, and as they had always said they were, as in Psalm 82, verse 6. They wanted to believe that they were gods and they were self-sovereign, and they didn't need this cacodemon Yahweh to be their king in heaven, and they didn't need these kings on earth misleading them into disaster after disaster. So the kings lasted from Saul to Zedekiah, and then the Second Temple period supposedly happened. And once again, they fell under foreign rule. There were good times and bad times, but they were not really self-sovereign. They were not really gods. They did not live in a state of anarchy where they made their own rules, where they lived by their own free will, where they were not under constant curses and threats of Mosaic law. Instead, they were still bound to each other by this Mosaic law, and they still essentially maintained a form of theocracy, especially within their own minds. They all felt united as the chosen people of this evil God, as much as they hated this God. It kept them together, and it maintained some kind of order amongst them, and it preserved them by segregating them from everyone else, telling them that they were chosen and that they must treat each other as if each one of them was divine in his or her essence. Then something amazing happened. They picked up on this idea of the Savior, which the Romans had and the Greeks had, and they wanted a king like Pharaoh, a demigod, who was a divine sovereign, but in a man's body. So there was a combination of the theocracy and the monarchy in the form of Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ was said to be a demigod born of the gods, as Pharaoh was, as the kings and emperors of Persia, Greece, and Rome claimed to be. The Jews picked up on that, and they said, hey, wait a minute, we got this guy. We got Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ combined the theocracy and the monarchy all in one. And amazingly, he rejected Mosaic law and became antinomian. And Paul said that the law is a curse. So now they finally had the best of all worlds. They were anarchists, they were theocratic, and they had a monarch all wrapped into one. But this was all a trap that was set up for the non-Israelites to adopt. And then they put in a little catch that the kingdom of this demigod was actually in heaven. And they would have to die to get there. They would have to free their souls from the prison of the body to go live in this kingdom that practiced anarchy, where the theocracy and the monarchy were combined into King Messiah. And so we have these forces among the Hebrews, this desire to destroy all of the non-Israelite monarchs, to destroy all of the non-Israelite theocracies, to destroy the non-Israelite gods, so that all tribute is paid to the kings and priests of Israel, and all sacrifices are offered to the God of Israel, Seth Typhon, so that a world government is formed. And we have battle after battle. Among the Christians, they fought to determine how to serve King Jesus. The 30 Years' Wars, the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, the English Civil Wars, all of this strife brought on by the Reformation and the Puritans, who were very close to the Israelites, sparked and heightened this struggle to determine should man live in anarchy, theocracy, monarchy, or some combination of those three forms of governance. And this really came to a height in England among a group called the Levelers, who were inspired by the Brethren of Free Spirits. And I think we should transition and look at first this biblical narrative, and then how this came to a height in the 1600s through these civil wars in England, and how these civil wars in England inspired Spinoza and Shabbatai Tzvi. So as I said, the Bible creates a narrative transitioning from bondage, where the Hebrew people were supposedly kept as slaves by the Pharaoh, who was a demigod who imposed the divine laws of Ra on their entire empire, including their slaves, the Hebrews. And the Hebrews wanted to be free of this bondage and become self-sovereign. So Moses, with his new god, Seth Typhon, which he took over from the Egyptians who had rejected Seth Typhon in favor of Horus, Isis, Osiris, and Ra. This god supposedly then chose the Israelites to be his people. And Exodus chapter 5, verse 1 says, "Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, 'This is what the Lord, the God of Israel,'" Seth Typhon, "says, 'Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness.'" Seth Typhon was the god of the wilderness, the god of the red lands, as opposed to the fertile black lands of Ra. Seth Typhon wanted the Israelites to become his chosen people and eventually to destroy the Egyptians. So he set them free in his kingdom. We now have the Israelites freeing themselves from the bondage of Ra, freeing themselves from the Pharaoh, only to fall into the hands of Moses and Aaron, the spokesman for this demonic god of chaos and darkness, only to be delivered into the wilderness where they suffered horribly. And they complained to Moses and they complained to the God of Israel, "Why have you done this to us? Why did you bring us from bondage into new bondage, from slavery to slavery, from horrors to horrors?" And this has been the constant struggle. And from that emerged the era of the judges and the prophets and the theocracy of Israel, the grand theocracy of Israel, where they were led by these people who claimed to have spoken to the God of Israel and imposed the God's laws on the Israelites and interpreted those laws. That was the form of government they had, and these people became privileged. They lived in special houses. They collected taxes in the form of the sacrifices and the tithings. And that was the government they lived under, and they were slaves to that sovereignty. Then they asked for a king so that they could be like the Gentiles and have this king who would lead them in battle. And I think this is very critical for people to understand, because this is the basis of all of these Hebrew revolutions against monarchies around the world, to replace them with an Israelite monarchy, to replace them with the sovereignty of their God King, and ultimately to have the King Messiah combine the theocracy and the monarchy in one as a demigod, as the appearance of God on earth, and ultimately in the Shabbataians, for that to be antinomian and for them to abandon all the laws of the cacodemon, Seth Typhon, the donkey god, Yao, and to have this king set them all free, because this king, Shabbatai Tzevi, said that essentially your will is the only law that you have to obey. Do as thou wilt, and reject all of the Mosaic laws because it's all garbage. It only ever existed in people's imaginations, and it brought the curse of death. And you can become immortal and androgynous, as Shabbatai Tzvi claimed to have done, by simply rejecting all of this nonsense, this fiction of these gods. And I'll explain that a bit later. So in 1 Samuel chapter 8, it says, Israel asked for a king. Remember that prior to this, they had existed under the theocracy of the judges, and they now want a monarchy. And initially, the idea of getting out of Egypt was to have anarchy, to have self-sovereignty. So they kept falling into one form of slavery or another, and that is the Hebrew dilemma. They don't know how to set themselves free, and ultimately they want to resolve it by killing everyone else off and proclaiming that they themselves are independent gods. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So the theocracy wasn't working. And Spinoza talked about how Mosaic law is garbage, and that it was designed, he believed, designed and engineered to lead to the fall of the Israelites, that it too was a trap, like I keep saying, Christianity is a trap. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, as all the other nations, as the Goyim, have. But when they said, Give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. The Lord told him, Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. That's a crucial line. That shows that monarchy on earth offends the kingship of God in heaven. And that's how Jesus came about, to bridge that gap and to make, as some believed him to be descendant of David, but he's actually the Messiah, son of Joseph, to bridge that gap and have David be a divine figure, a demigod, a God-man, and ultimately in the form of Shabbatai Tzevi, to flip that where there is no Father, there is no God. It's the Messiah himself who is God. And then all of his people, in the form of the Shabbataians, each individually finally achieves what the Hebrews set about to accomplish by leaving Egypt, and that is self-sovereignty and divine status. But they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. In other words, the theocracy didn't work. They didn't follow God's self-proclaimed spokesman, and that really upset Seth Typhon, because his chosen people realized what a bastard he was and didn't want to have anything to do with him. I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you Just as they worshiped the golden calf and rebelled against Moses, they are now rebelling against Samuel, but they're really rebelling against Seth Typhon. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. And this is telling them that they are going back into the bondage that Seth Typhon supposedly freed them from in Egypt. They're going under a king. They're going under a pharaoh. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest." Sounds a lot like what they suffered from in Egypt. "And still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day, because he told you so, and you didn't listen." This God of Israel is an SOB, a vindictive SOB. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. "No," they said, "we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, like the Goyim, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles." And that he does, and leads them into disaster after disaster and gets them fighting against each other. When Samuel heard all that the people said, he repeated it before the Lord. The Lord answered, "Listen to them and give them a king." Then Samuel said to the Israelites, "Everyone go back to your own town." This has had such it's incredible the impact that this little chapter has had on human history for 2,300 years, as the Hebrews have viewed themselves as trying to set mankind free from monarchy, when their real motive is to destroy all the other nations and make their monarch the king over all the earth, and to make their God the king in heaven, but ultimately to betray him because he is such an evil figure, and become gods themselves. This is all about obtaining divine sovereignty, first by destroying all other nations, exterminating all other peoples, eliminating their theocracies, their priesthoods, their pagan gods, eliminating their kings and queens, their monarchies, and then establishing a singular Hebrew king as monarch over the entire earth, but making him a demigod and ultimately a god who destroys his father by simply denying the reality of his father and his father's laws. And that culminated in the Shabbatians. But the Shabbatians copied it from the English movements and from the Germanic movements, which I'm going to explain in a bit. So we have this uniting of the theocracy and the monarchy in the King Messiah in the form of Jesus Christ, who said in John chapter 10, verse 30, "I and the Father are one." And that came to be a belief in the Orthodoxy, in the Trinity, and the idea that the king in heaven became a king on earth in the form of Jesus Christ, but that Christians have to return to that heavenly kingdom which spawned their souls and unite with God in the world to come that will be a heavenly kingdom. In other words, they all have to die out. So Christianity fulfills the same plan that got underway in 1 Samuel chapter 8, where the Israelites want a king, and they want to get rid of their God and turn the earth into their heaven in Olam Haba, the world to come for them, which will be on the earth. And they have duped the gullible Christians into believing that they should leave the earth so they can enter a heavenly kingdom which doesn't exist, worshiping a God that the Israelites themselves will no longer believe in. Christians also set up utopian, socialist, communist communities. And this has had that tremendous impact of inspiring Marxism, which has claimed hundreds of millions of lives, and establishing socialism, which destroyed the Christian monarchies, where the Gentiles, the Goyim, the non-Israelites, had their own kings to lead them in their battles. And instead, Christianity was used to pit these kings against each other and to create struggles among non-Israelites as to how to best worship the God of Israel. And the Reformation cost millions and millions of lives, at least 10 million lives in the 30 Years' Wars, the War of the Three Kingdoms, the English Civil Wars, all the wars of the Holy Roman Empire, etc. This cost tens of millions of Europeans' lives for this battle of how to establish what proper form of theocracy and monarchy ought to lead the non-Israelites after they abandoned all of their original emperor god kings and instead adopted the Jewish God King, Jesus Christ, who has brought them into disaster after disaster and ruin, created the whole Dark Ages. It was only when they went back through the Renaissance to what the ancients believed that they finally woke up as to what reality is to a certain extent. But we are once again hearing chants of establishing a theocracy in America, no less, of Christian nationalists who are once again waging this ancient Hebrew dilemma. How do we combine the theocracy and the monarchy and destroy all human freedom and make everyone the subjects of these people who presume to speak for God and who presume to be the God King on earth? And we have chants from these paid propagandists working for the communists and the Israelis telling us that Trump is the God Emperor, telling us that Putin is the God Emperor. This same game has been played on humanity for 2,300 years, and it is so important for people to understand what this narrative represents and how it is employed to pit us against each other so that we destroy ourselves. Anarchy, freedom from the bondage of Egypt, falling into theocracy, becoming the slave of the king in heaven, falling into monarchy, becoming the slave of the king on earth, rebelling against that to free ourselves from the bondage of Egypt, to enter the anarchy of the wilderness, the Garden of Eden, return to paradise. This was the promise of Rousseau, that we should become the savage man, the natural man, the man of paradise. It is this same mythology that always works against us and creates tensions. And I am pleading with humanity to abandon these Abrahamic faiths, which feed off of this narrative to create constant conflict, the overthrowing of governments, the building up of empires only to destroy them, so that these taxes can be collectively levied against all of us, so that their kings and their Shabbos kings can serve them and destroy us, so that ultimately their God King can lead a world in which we no longer exist. The Christians, the early Christians, were certainly communistic. Carpocrates and his son Epiphanists were openly communistic. They even said that women were common property and should be shared among all people, all the men, no matter how degenerate and perverse. This was terribly dysgenic. You had the best women breeding with the worst men, and the best men breeding with the worst women. The communists adopted all of that. Marx adopted all of that. But Marxism is the legacy of Christianity. Acts chapter 4, verse 32, all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned houses or lands sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, sold a field he owned and brought the money and put it at the apostles' feet. In every instance where these communist utopias have been attempted, they have been terrible, terrible failures, and they resulted in the deaths of hundreds of millions of people in the form of modern Marxism. Mao's Great Leap Forward probably wiped out 75 million Chinese. Trotsky, Kaganovich, Ilya Ehrenberg, and all the Marxists of the Soviet Union killed probably 50 to 75 million people, maybe even 100 million people. So this Christian communism has had very, very bad fruit. And this Christian communism emerged in the beliefs of the brethren of the free spirit who wanted to free themselves from Pharaoh, free themselves from the clerics, the theocracy, and free themselves from the monarchy, and declare themselves to be independent gods, free spirits, ultimate free spirits. They believed in, and this was from the 1200s to the 1400s in southern Germany through Bohemia and into Italy. Autotheism, in other words, a belief that the perfected soul and God are indistinguishably one. Here we have the idea of the Christ, that the Father and the Son are one, that the theocracy and the monarchy become self-sovereignty, and the individual becomes God. This was often expressed through the language of indistinction or annihilation. This belief would be heretical because it would undermine the necessary distinction between fallen, created being and creator. Denial of the necessity of Christ, the church, and its sacraments for salvation. So in this sense, they have gotten rid of the sovereignty of God the King. They have gotten rid of theocracy in the form of the priests ruling over them, and Jesus the King on earth ruling over them. And in that sense, they have also gotten rid of the monarchy. Denial of the necessity of Christ, the church, and its sacraments for salvation, such that austerity and reliance on the Holy Spirit was believed to be sufficient for salvation. It's interesting how these are all ascetic movements like Diogenes, the Cynics, and the Stoics. And the monastics were also communists. They believed that they could communicate directly with God and did not need the Catholic Church for intercession. Use of the language of erotic union with Christ. There was all kinds of sexual degeneracy among the early Christians, especially the Gnostics, through to the Shabbatians and the Frankists, who would engage in orgies and degenerate sexual practices. The communists openly did that in Bavaria. Eugen Leviné and Tobias Axelrod would engage in orgies in the streets. Trotsky would capture young females and quarantine his soldiers with them so that they could rape these young females. He would have prostitutes meet his soldiers on trains, etc., etc. Antinomian sentiments. Nothing is a sin but what is thought to be a sin. In other words, all the law is simply a mental fiction. Mosaic law is a lie. That's what the Christians taught. Critics of the free spirit interpreted their beliefs to mean that they considered themselves to be incapable of sin and above the moral conduct of the church. As I've taught before, that's my unique insight. That's the story of the stoning of Mary, showing that it is the law that is the curse and the law that brings death. And if you simply disbelieve in the law, you lose your status as a sinner and you become free, just as Mary was freed from the curse of death for supposedly sinning, and sin disappears from the earth, and together with sin, death disappears from the earth. Verses such as Galatians chapter 5, verse 18, those who are driven or led by the Spirit of God are no longer under the law, were seen as foundational to such beliefs, anti-clerical sentiment. So we have Christianity here forming the basis for what was to become Shabbatayanism and Frankism, which formed the basis for what was to become Marxism and communism. During this struggle brought on by the 30 Years' Wars and the Reformation, where the power of the Catholic Church began to wane and where there were internal fights in Europe as to what form theocracy and monarchy ought to take, and should monarchy be destroyed and popular sovereignty replace it. There was a group called the Levelers that was founded in England. The Levelers were a political movement active during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, who were committed to popular sovereignty. They wanted to be free from Pharaoh. Extended suffrage, equality before the law, and religious tolerance. The Puritans were always said to seek religious tolerance, but what they really wanted was to be religiously intolerant, which is why they went to America, so that they could impose their religious intolerance on everyone around them. The hallmark of Leveler thought was its populism, as shown by its emphasis on equal rights and their practice of reaching the public through pamphlets, petitions, and vocal appeals to the crowd. This inspired Spinoza. It inspired Shabbatai Tzvi, because his father was doing business with the English in Smyrna and was exposed to these English ideas, these ideas of popular sovereignty, of overthrowing the non-Israelite monarch. And the Levelers, then some of the Levelers became the Diggers, agrarian socialists. And they also opposed the monarchy. And the Diggers sought to establish a communistic utopia, the Christian idea, the idea of the king and the theocracy becoming one and setting the people free from Pharaoh and releasing them into the wilderness, where they become slaves of the soil instead of slaves of Pharaoh. And then the Diggers, some of them became what were called the Ranters. And the Ranters are the ones who really inspired the Shabbataians. and may have been inspired themselves by the Lurian Kabbalists and by the Zohar. Their central idea was pantheistic, that God is essentially in every creature, including themselves. If God be in all things, then in all creatures that have life whatsoever, so that wherein is man better than those, or hath any preeminence above these. My most excellent majesty in me hath strangely and variously transformed this form. And behold, by mine own almightiness, in me I have been changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the sound of the trump. They have become gods. They have transferred the sovereignty of the King in heaven to themselves. They have become Jesus Christ themselves. They have not only become demigods, but actual gods. And actual gods follow their own thoughts. They don't follow the abstract fictions of Mosaic law. They embraced antinomianism and believe that Christians are freed by grace from the necessity of obeying Mosaic law, rejecting the very notion of obedience. They held that believers are free from all traditional restraints and that sin is a product only of the imagination. The Ranters revived the brethren of the free spirit's amoralism and stressed the desire to surpass the human condition and become godlike. Sounds a lot like what's happening today with cyborgs and with brain implants and with homunculi being bred in laboratories of male skin cells becoming egg cells, so that the Messiah, son of David, can repopulate the world with 600,000 immortal androgynous gods. For indeed, sin hath its conception only in the imagination. Therefore, so long as the act was in God, or nakedly produced by God, it was as holy as God. This is the ancient theme of Satan. He wants a kingdom of his own. He wants to be a god himself. I can, if it be my will, kiss and hug ladies and love my neighbor's wife as myself without sin. Again, sexual degeneracy playing a major part in this. They denied the authority of the church. Goodbye, theocracy. Of accepted religious practice and of scripture. Goodbye, the King in heaven. In fact, they denied the power of any authority in general. Say goodbye to the monarchy. So we have this spread of these Hebrew beliefs resulting in the destruction of European monarchy, which ultimately took place during World War I and World War II, to be replaced by the League of Nations and the United Nations and all of the socialistic, communistic republics which emerged to usurp the empires of the monarchs. And now we are moving toward Christian nationalism, of the restoration, the second coming of King Messiah, so that these two forms of government, monarchy and theocracy, can be united in one person who becomes a man-god. No matter what Scripture, saints, or churches say, if that within thee do not condemn thee, thou shalt not be condemned. In other words, you're your own judge. You are God. Kings, princes, lords, great ones must bow to the poorest peasants. This is what the Christians said when they said, the least among you shall be first. And then Mr. Marx made it the dictatorship of the proletariat. All of these communist ideas emerged out of Christianity. and Christianity was crafted by the Hebrews to set themselves free from Pharaoh, to combine theocracy, monarchy, and anarchy into one form, into each individual self-sovereign Israelite as an independent God among the 600,000 souls of immortal androgynous gods, which are to be the Hebrews in the world to come. And this has produced bloodshed around the world, overthrowing of governments again and again, pitting people against their own government based upon these same premises which form the narrative of the Hebrew Bible and the Hebrew dilemma. How do you escape bondage without falling into theocracy or monarchy, and without suffering the degradations and mutual strife, the brutish existence that Hobbes described of anarchy? Is the savage man of Rousseau a myth? Can we exist in paradise as the savage man, as the anarchist, with no leader? Or will we turn our knives brother against brother, Cain against Abel, and slay one another? All of this crap that has been heaped upon humanity for 2,300 years is this Hebrew dilemma: anarchy, theocracy, or monarchy. This really reached a head in the Hebrew community at this time when they started to copy those English movements of the levelers, the diggers, the Puritans, and most especially the ranters. And the man who really did this was Shabbatai Zevi, and he got a lot of his doctrines from his buddy Nathan of Gaza. And they copied the Christian idea of combining theocracy and monarchy in one God-man. This is from Heinrich Getz's History of the Jews. Getz strongly opposed Kabbalah. He also heavily criticized Spinoza, who was pointing out the deficiency of Israelite theocracy, Israelite monarchy, and the impact that those foolish belief systems, which he believed were set up as a trap against the Israelites, and how they had destroyed the Israelites down through history. But Spinoza leaned toward Christianity, and Heinrich Getz hated him for that. And Heinrich Getz strongly resented the fact that Spinoza started to clue the Christian world into what I'm explaining to you today. Although he didn't have the benefit of all the history that I have the benefit of Marxism and Shabbatayanism, to take it even further and further explain this Hebrew dilemma. But Heinrich Getz strongly resented that Spinoza had spilled the beans on that. The fundamental conception of the Zohar, the Bible of the Kabbalists, is that in the time of grace, in the world of order, Olam Ha-Tikkun, world of rectification, the laws of Judaism, the regulations concerning lawful and forbidden things, would completely lose their significance. That was the antinomianism introduced by Jesus Christ, who talked about how stupid it was to follow laws on the Sabbath, which caused people hunger, and Paul saying that the law was a curse, etc., etc. Now this time, the Shabbatayans' thought had already begun. Consequently, the minute ritualistic code of the Shulchan Aruch ought no longer to be held binding. That was a very important Kabbalistic book. It talked about how it was lawful to kill off the non-Israelites. Shabbatai didn't oppose that regulation, which was actually a freedom expressed to the Israelites. Whether Shabbatai himself drew this conclusion is doubtful, but some of his trusted adherents gave this theory prominence. A certain bitterness towards the Talmud and the Talmudic method of teaching prevailed in this circle. There was a war from the 1200s onwards between the Spanish Kabbalists and the Ashkenazi rabbinical class, that who was going to lead and win the hearts and minds and souls of the Hebrew peoples. The Shabbatayan mystics felt themselves confined by the close meshes of the rabbinical network and sought to disentangle it loop by loop. They set up a new deity, substituting a man god for the God of Israel. So like in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the sovereignty went from the king in heaven to the king on earth, but he also maintained the theocracy by proclaiming himself to be God and replacing the God of Israel. In their wanton extravagance, the Kabbalists had also so entirely changed the conception of the deity that it had dwindled away into nothing. Well, not really. Yes, the king in heaven dwindled away into nothing, but it became the king on earth, Shabbatai Tzevi. On the other hand, they had so exalted and magnified the Messiah that he was close to God. The Shabbataians, or one of them, Samuel Primo perhaps, built on this foundation. From the divine bosom, the Ancient of Days, they said, a new divine personage had sprung, capable of restoring the order in the world and intended in the original plan of divine perfection, the Tikkun Olam, the rectification of the world. This new person was the Holy King, Malcha Kadisha, the Messiah, the primal man, Adam Kadmon. Adam Kadmon was androgynous, which is very important, as I'll explain, who would destroy evil, sin, and corruption and cause the dried up streams of grace to flow again. He, the Holy King, the Messiah, is the true God, the Redeemer and Savior of the world, the God of Israel. To him alone should prayers be addressed. They did not pray to Seth Typhon, Yahweh, the God of Israel. They prayed to Shabbatai Tzevi. The Holy King or Messiah combines two natures, one the male, the other female. The name of God in the Tetragrammaton is Yod-He Vav-He. Yod-He is his male aspect, Vav-He is his female aspect. You are not supposed to speak the divine name because the male aspect and the female aspect have been separated. That is why you will see people on the internet, Israelites on the internet, write God with a hyphen to replace the O. So you have G hyphen D, so that they are not speaking the Tetragrammaton. But the code that I'm going to reveal to you is that represents separating Yod-He and Vav-He into their male and female aspects and recognizing the division of the Godhead, which can only be restored by rebuilding the temple and anointing the Messiah, son of David. Only then will the divine name properly be pronounced in one word. Only then will you be able to write the little O in the middle of God so that the male and female are one. He can do no more on account of his higher wisdom than the creator of the world. Samuel Primo, who dispatched circulars and ordinances in the name of the Messianic King, often used the signature, I, the Lord, your God, Shabbatai Tzevi. He is calling himself God and combining theocratic rule on the earth with monarchical rule, but then combining it with anarchism because Mosaic law has been completely rejected in favor of the occult principle, do as thou wilt, which renders each individual an independent God. Whether the Smyrna fanatic, Shabbatai Tzevi, authorized such blasphemous presumptuousness, Gretz was really pissed off, cannot be decided, any more than whether in his heart he considered the Jewish law null and void. For although some Shabbataians who uttered these absurdities pretended to have heard them from his own lips, other disciples asserted that he was an adherent of traditional Judaism nonsense. Gretz so wanted to believe that Kabbalah was not real that he denied reality himself. The truth probably is that Shabbatai Tzevi, absorbed in idle ruminating, accepted everything which the more energetic among his followers taught or suggested. They began the dissolution of Judaism by the transformation of the fast of the 10th of Tebeth, Asara Be Tebeth, into a day of rejoicing. Samuel Primo, in the name of his divinity, directed a circular to the whole of Israel in semi-official form. The first begotten Son of God, Shabbatai Tzevi, Messiah and Redeemer of the people of Israel, to all the sons of Israel, peace. Shabbatai Tzevi presented himself as God, as a combination of anarchy, theocracy, and monarchy in his own person. This group, the Shabbataians, and their offspring, the Frankists and the Dernmei, have been spreading violent, genocidal revolution around the globe. They produced the Great Leap Forward of Mao Zedong, which took 75 million lives. They produced the Armenian genocide through the Dernmei, which took 1.5 million Armenian lives. Probably something like 1 million Greek and Assyrian Christian lives, which played a big part in World War I, both in fomenting it and fighting it, which produced the nation of Israel, which produced the Middle Eastern wars, which took tens of millions of lives. These revolutionaries produced Marxism and the wars on the monarchy. The First World War was a massive socialist revolution to overthrow the empires and replace them with communistic empires. World War II was a communistic and a Zionistic revolution to fulfill these ambitions of Shabbatai Tzevi. So I hope I've done my job and clarified what I mean by the Hebrew dilemma, by this that'll be my next one. This terrible, terrible struggle of the Hebrews to free themselves from bondage. But what does that ultimately mean? That ultimately means destroying all non-Israelite theocracy, destroying all non-Israelite monarchy, destroying all the pagan gods, and ultimately eliminating all the heathen peoples, all the non-Israelites from the face of the earth, and all of the terrible calamities that humanity has suffered because of this contrived Hebrew dilemma, which was crafted as the narrative of the Torah and the Tanakh and the Christian Bible, has wrought misery, death, destruction, civil war, all other kinds of wars, the construction of empires, the dissolution of empires, brothers fighting brothers, destroying each other. All of this comes out of this contrived Hebrew dilemma. So how do we get out of the Hebrew dilemma? We cannot look to these same peoples to engineer for us systems of government based upon their mythology of the Hebrew dilemma. We can't look to the communists. We can't look to the libertarians. We can't look to Nazis. We can't look to all of these horrible systems of government. And we should not be looking to destroy our countries as if we ourselves are caught in the Hebrew dilemma. They try to impose their belief systems on us, but they twist it in a way that we become self-hating and turn against our own governments. And they use this narrative of the Hebrew dilemma to engineer systems of government which will grant them the freedom to become tyrants who oppress us. And I think we have to become learned men and women and understand the nature of this Hebrew dilemma, which culminated in Shabbatayanism, and in which they believe they are now gods who have sovereignty over us, who can collect taxes for us, make decisions to rule over us, enslave us. They have become the Pharaoh. They have become the gods on earth in their eyes. And they are actually ruling over us, but bringing us into destruction. So they believe they have flipped the script on the Egyptians, and they have resolved the Hebrew dilemma, and they will ultimately resolve it completely by getting rid of us and turning their progeny into 600,000 immortal androgynes. I certainly hope that at least some of you can at least intuitively understand what I am attempting to explain. I think that Spinoza was very much aware of a great deal of this and tried to warn the world about it, which is why he was so heavily persecuted and why he was excommunicated. He was an advocate of free speech, and they tried to seal his lips with an excommunication. It's so ironic and so typical of what's happening today. I again want to thank the kind and generous people who contributed so that I could produce this video. If you would like to help me keep going making these videos, please do contribute in the links in the description below and at my website, cjbbooks.com. Thank you so very much for watching, and I will see you next time.